Okay, good morning, everyone. So once again, welcome to the Department of Economics at Ateneo de Manila University and Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development Seminar Series. We hope you enjoyed our little virtual tour of the university for the newcomers. And hopefully, after the pandemic, we can all welcome you in person in our department and the university also. Okay, before we start our seminar, let me just remind everyone of our house rules. We will let the speaker finish his presentation first before we entertain questions. Zoom participants, kindly stay muted and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation, except of course our speaker. During Q&A, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. Participants on Facebook, please post your questions in the comment section. When asking your question both on Zoom or on Facebook, please also acknowledge your institutional affiliation. Slides, videos, and other materials from the seminar are posted on our website only when the speaker gives his consent for sharing them. And today our speaker already gave his consent. Okay, so we are pleased to have Professor Nori as our speaker this morning. He is a professor in the Department of Economics and a research fellow in the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, or UHERO, at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. After completing PhD at University of Minnesota, he conducted research as an Earth Institute Fellow at Columbia University before moving to Honolulu. His research fields are environmental, energy, and resource economics, with publications including papers in Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, Journal of International Economics, European Economic Review, and Energy Economics. He has served on the editorial boards for Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, Environmental Economics and Policy Studies, International Review of Environmental Resource Economics, and Singapore Economic Review. He is a recipient of the Outstanding Publication Award from the Society for Environmental Economics and Policy Studies in 2021. This morning, he is here with us to share his ongoing research titled The Effects of Sea Level Rise on Property Value and Managed Retreat in Honolulu. Without further ado, let us all welcome to the virtual floor, Professor Nori Tarui.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Maha, for a very kind introduction. And yeah, thank you everyone for taking time to attend the seminar with me. So I'm gonna share my screen right now. Okay, hope this is working. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about work in progress project about the effects of sea level rise on property value and implications to manage retreat in Honolulu. This is a joint project with a few other researchers at University of Hawaii at Manoa, McKenna Kaufman, Kualnok Lam, and Seth Urbanski. Okay. So here are the research questions that we try to address with this paper. So does exposure to the risk of sea level rise affect the market price of housing properties on Oahu, where the city and county of Honolulu is located? And secondly, how does the impact estimate depend on the type of the sea level rise exposure, and how do they interact with other coastal risk factors? This is the second research question. And I'll conclude my presentation with some implications about the managed retreat, or so this is a strategy for climate change adaptation in the coastal area. Okay. So let me summarize our main findings. So here we apply like hedonic methods to the detailed data set of like housing transactions on Honolulu. And So what we find is that comparing properties of the same type in the same neighborhood with similar geographic locations, like similar distance from the coastline and similar elevation, we find that the housing property is subject to sea level rise that is expected to happen over the century. So it's going to be about 1 meter sea level rise. That is associated with about a 15 to 20% discount in the transaction price. So what we can say here is that sea level rise is like happening gradually, but the major sea level rise will happen in the future. So it is a future disaster event, but the effects are already embedded in the current market transaction of the coastal properties. And if you look at the type of sea level rise exposure, it turns out that not only the chronic sea level rise and flooding inundation throughout the year, the seasonal flooding also matters. In other words, if you look at the properties that will be inundated only seasonally, those are experiencing discount in the property values as well. And other coastal risk factors matter too. So for example, there are some housing properties protected with seawalls or what's called shoreline hardening. Those seawalls are good for those properties, but the neighbors seem to experience negative impacts. Right? So in other words, if you have a coastal property that does not have seawalls, but if your neighbors do, then that seems to imply a discount on your property value. So I'm going to talk more about this point later on. So the motivation, you're looking at a map, sorry, not a map, a picture of the prediction of sea level rise by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, over the next centuries. And the scientists' consensus is that we might expect something close to 1 meter sea level rise by the end of the century. And the prediction is similar if you look at the state of Hawaii and Oahu in particular. And the more recent report from the Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission from the state of Hawaii indicate that the 1 meter sea level rise, that might actually happen sooner than the end of this century. It might happen a little earlier than that. And my colleagues at the University of Hawaii in coastal geology and earth science, so they have been studying the extent of coastal erosion and sea level rise prediction. So what they say is that by 2050, up to 40% of beaches on Oahu might be lost due to sea level rise. But it turns out that this is not just due to sea level rise associated with climate change, but again, the seawalls and shoreline hardening seem to be exacerbating the negative effect of sea level rise on coastal erosion. So on the upper right, you are looking at an aerial photo of a property protected by seawalls. And then you can also see that the neighbors are experiencing coastal erosion because the neighbors have seawalls. So this is becoming a big issue in Hawaii. So right now, private properties cannot set up seawalls on their own. That is prohibited, but still there have been some seawalls historically set up along the coastline. And so what to do about those seawalls, that is one of the major coastal management challenges in Hawaii. And again, so I said that sea level rise it's about future prediction, but we can see what sea level rise might indicate by looking at the high tide or king tide events that's already happening on the island. So in the picture here, you're looking at like Waikiki Beach. And so this is a high tide day when most of the beach is inundated with ocean waves. So the point is that with sea level rise, we might, a day like that might be more usual. Like we might see that king tides might stay with us throughout the year, right? So that's the challenge with sea level rise. And sea level rise also affects the coastal infrastructure, such as walkways along the coastline, or even the roads, right? On the right-hand side, you see a road. This is on the northeast side of the island of Oahu. And so from time to time, the high tides would inundate the road, and this has a major impact on the traffic in the area. And already we are experiencing like sea level rise and coastal erosion in some properties. And on the right-hand side, you see that the walkway between the coastal properties are flooded. So this happens occasionally as well. Okay, so the focus of this presentation is about the effect on housing prices. But the question is, will the homeowners care about the risk of sea level rise? And here, there's an indication that maybe the homeowners and real estate agents do care about sea level rise. And so here you're looking at recent edits on the real estate purchase contract template that many real estate agents use on the island. And so back in 2018, there was a provision on this template added regarding climate change. So basically this is saying, okay, look, potential home buyers, you should be aware of the risk associated with climate change and natural hazards if you are buying coastal properties, right? So that's what this provision is saying. There's another similar addendum to the oceanfront property transaction. And again, this addendum is saying that, okay, there are risks associated with coastal properties because of sea level rise. So if you are to purchase the property, you should be aware of the risk. Right? So in this sense, we can see that probably this is a salient issue to potential buyers of real estate in Hawaii. So here you're looking at the Google, what do you call it, Google Trends about like how many times people Google search for sea level rise as a keyword from January 2014 to the end of I think mid 2021. So here you're looking, you can see that occasionally there is a big spike in the number of times people search sea level rise as Google keywords. And that coincides with the major flooding events, storm events, or publication of major IPCC reports, for example. Right? And what's interesting is that in particular in Hawaii, right? Hawaii here shows up as number one. This is suggesting that among other states, people in Hawaii seem to be searching sea level rise keyword on Google most intensively. And if you look at the Google Trends in Hawaii, right? Again, you can see clearly that events such as Hurricane Katrina and flooding in New Orleans and major flooding events in the state, for example, the one in Kauai back in 2014, those seem to be associated with an increase in the number of times people search sea level rise as a keyword. Okay, so to address the question of whether sea level rise risk exposure affects the transaction price of housing properties, we use geospatial information. We apply geospatial information on the housing parcels, census blocks, block groups, and coastline of the state that's available from the state GIS data program. We also apply data from a company called Zillow. So Zillow is a internet portal for like housing search. So that's one of the major websites where many people go to search like housing properties. So we have a complete property assessment and transaction data from Zillow. It's called Z-Tracks. And we combine that with the sea level rise exposure data that is provided by two institutions. One is a US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. So this agency provides national level, nationwide sea level rise exposure data. And the other one is from Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission. So they have a finite grid data on a sea level rise exposure. That's a 5 meter by 5 meter grid. And we also check the elevation of each property by using USGS data. So the sample used for this study is limited to the coastal properties. In particular, we are looking at 0.25 miles from the coastline. So all the residential properties within this coastline are in our sample. So that's about 15% of all residential parcels on Oahu. Okay, so I mentioned that there are different types of sea level rise exposure. So here, let me talk a little bit about the differences. So one measurement is called passive flooding. And then we have additional measurements. So passive flooding, so this is the most often used indicator of sea level rise exposure. It's often called bathtub modeling in the sense that mainly you look at the elevation of each land parcel and see if that land is inundated with sea level rise in a mechanic way. Right? So this is passive flooding. It's relatively easy to compute. Right? But then there are some caveats on passive flooding. So here I'm quoting a recent paper on this topic. It says, passive flooding modeling does not provide a comprehensive picture of sea level rise hazards because it ignores dynamic processes such as seasonal waves, storm surge, erosion that have been shown to have a considerable impact on coastal communities. So to address this issue, we look at another measurement. It's called annual high wave flooding. So this measurement takes into account the fact that so waves have seasonality, but in some season you have a pretty high wave, and this high wave causes extra flooding beyond what the passive flooding indicates. So this measurement takes into account this additional potential flooding. And sea level rise will also affect the profile of the coastal land shape, right? There will be erosion, and erosion of the coast will exacerbate the flooding. So this is what the coastal erosion measurement takes into account. Right? And then the main indicator of interest that we are going to apply is called sea level rise exposure area, or SLEXA for short. So SLEXA takes into account all those. So passive flooding, annual highway flooding, and coastal erosion. Right? Right? This is a comprehensive measurement of sea level rise risk exposure. And so you're looking at the map of the island of Oahu, where Honolulu is located. You can see that even within this relatively small island, you see differences across localities in terms of the extent of sea level rise exposure. Right? In other words, in some areas, you see that larger share of housing properties are subject to sea level rise exposure. Okay. Excuse me, I'm gonna just check. And so you see a similar pattern depending on the level of sea level rise exposure. And okay, so another complication is this. So here you're looking at a map with information about what's called on-site sewage disposal. So what is that? Well, some of the housing properties are not connected to public sewage. They have their own on-site, either cesspool or a septic tank. And those are like major public health hazards, right? If those houses that are not connected to sewage get inundated with flooding, then that's gonna, the wastewater is gonna get discharged, and that's gonna cause a major disaster. So we can see that that is a major policy concern down the road. Yeah. So the state of Hawaii seriously needs to actually address this issue of on-site disposal system along the coastline, okay, which are subject to sea level rise exposure. Yeah, this is from existing study looking at the US nationwide sea level rise exposure issue. But one thing you can notice that in Honolulu, the share of properties that are subject to sea level rise exposure tends to be higher than the US mainland coastal average. Okay, so to address to talk about the empirical strategy to address the research question. So here we apply a hedonic model. First, we apply the model specification adapted by the existing study, Bernstein et al., using the nationwide data. So there, we would regress the log of housing price transaction on the extent of sea level rise exposure, that's SLRE, and XIT is the property characteristics. And then we have ER fixed effect, delta T. And mu B is going to be a key set of variables for identification. So what we try to do is to make an apples to apples comparison of properties, right? And to do that, what we do is to compare housing properties with or without exposure to sea level rise that are otherwise located in the same zip code or census tract area and same level of elevation, same level of same distance from coastline, and the same type of housing, like either single family or condominium apartments. So we do that to make sure that we can isolate the effect of sea level rise exposure on the property prices. But this approach in the existing study might not be sufficient. And the reason is that you can imagine that if you have a coastal property, right, other things being equal, maybe you would expect that coastal properties might have higher value, right? Because maybe you have great ocean view, you have good access to beaches, that will tend to increase your property price. And also there are some other coastal risk hazard, right? Such as those on-site disposal systems and seawalls and so on. So what we do in the next specification is to take into account those other coastal risk factors, such as seawalls, flood zone designation, and so on. And we'll see how the results might be different. Okay, so just to give you the idea of how prevalent the risk is. So here we see that if you look at 3.2 foot or 1 meter sea level rise, like more than 900 properties will be exposed to sea level rise. And yeah, more than 200 properties are associated with cesspools or septic tanks, like on-site disposal systems. So you can see that this is a major policy concern, the island. And if you look at the seawalls, so out of the 25,000 houses in the study area, so this is within 0.25 miles from the coastline, we see that close to 5% of properties have seawalls, and about 3% of properties do not have seawalls, but neighbors do, right? So that's the situation in Honolulu. Yeah. And but I should remind you that the unit of analysis for this study is transaction. Right? So sometimes we see repeated transactions of the same property. Right? So that's caveat. Okay, so what do we find? So here's an empirical result. And what we find is that if we apply the approach taken in the existing study, then we see some mixed results, okay? Mixed in the following sense. So here you're looking at the effect of sea level rise on property values with the first model. So here you're looking at OLS estimate of the coefficient of sea level rise exposure with a different exposure from 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, up to 6 feet. So 3 feet roughly corresponds to like 1 meter sea level rise. Right? So you can see that 5 feet or 6 feet sea level rise, those do not seem to matter statistically, right, on property values. There's some discount associated with 3 or 4 feet sea level rise. But then with 1 foot or 2 feet sea level rise, the result is can be puzzling in that the effect seems to be even positive, right? And so our interpretation is that, so this is at the bottom, this beta hat estimate might be capturing not just the effect of sea level rise, but other attributes of coastal properties, right? So as I mentioned, if you have a coastal property like ocean front, if you have ocean view, and if you have great access to beaches, maybe that's gonna indicate premium on your property, right? So such premium might be what we are capturing with positive estimates of the 1 or 2 feet sea level rise exposed properties. Yeah, so we see similar mixed finding with other measurements of sea level rise. So this is based on SLEXA, the comprehensive sea level rise measure. But again, we don't see any negative impact. If anything, with 0.5 foot exposure, the effect is positive. Right? So that's so the result is very different from the existing studies that look at the US-wide, nationwide data. Okay, so, but what we find with another specification where we consider coastal risk factors, then here we see that are more reasonable results. So here, this is just a select variables and estimates, but if you look at, for example, on-site disposal, the presence of on-site disposal translates to about 70% discount on the housing properties. I mean, that's intuitive. If your house is not connected to public sewage, and if you have like cesspool or septic tank that are potential like public health disaster, then that's a discount, right? Whether you are on the flood zone, that doesn't seem to be associated with the housing price. And this is consistent with another earlier study indicating that people do not seem to be taking into account the insurance premium associated with properties located on the flood zone. And if you are on full waterfront, there is a premium. And then if you are exposed to sea level rise, that's a negative discount. It's about 20%. And if you have seawalls, that doesn't seem to be associated with a premium. But if you are exposed to sea level rise, then seawall seems to protect the value to some extent. But this is at the expense on the negative effects on neighbors, right? So if your neighbor has seawalls, that seems to have a negative effect on the property values. So here you're looking at an additional result associated with other types of sea level rise exposure, right? So with passive flooding, annual high wave, coastal erosion, and SLEXA, the comprehensive measure, we see that, for example, annual high wave is associated with a significant and negative impact. And so this indicates that with sea level rise, maybe not just the permanent increase in the sea level and flooding, but seasonal flooding seems to matter when it comes to the property values. And so I'm going to skip that. Okay, here. So this is a variation of placebo effects testing. So if you look at sea level rise or climate change associated with sea level rise, perhaps not many people or not even many scientists paid attention to that prior to, let's say, year 2000, right? So sure enough, if we change the sample to include property transactions between 1994 and 2000, so this is column 2, you see that the effect is even positive, right? So back then, before 2000, maybe people are not aware of sea level rise risk. And in that period, maybe the SLEXA measurement might be just capturing the premium associated with oceanfront properties. Yeah, that's the possible explanation. But then in more recent time, we will see a negative impact, right? Close to 20%. Skip that. So what's the implication about how people take into account the risk of sea level rise? Okay. So if we take the point estimate from our regression, and so we can infer the extent to which people are taking into account the risk of sea level rise when they purchase housing properties. And so if we make some assumptions following the literature, we find that effectively, right, the way in which people discount the housing values due to a sea level rise exposure, that is consistent with the hypothesis that people expect the 3.2-foot sea level rise to happen within like close to like 70 years from now. Right? So that's somewhat consistent with the IPCC estimate, surprisingly. So it seems that people seem to incorporate the risk of sea level rise, right? So market expected timing of sea level rise seems to be not too far from the IPCC estimate. Okay. So if we aggregate the the price discount due to sea level rise, we can see that up to $4 to $5 billion may be lost due to sea level rise exposure of coastal properties. Right? And this is also there's also an implication to the tax revenue to the government. Right? So lower property value translates to lower property tax assessment. Right? And so that means that perhaps the government collect like less revenues, right? Due to the sea level rise risk. So the implication is that when the state or the city governments consider how to adapt to this sea level rise risk, right? So this is really an issue of adaptation, right? I mean, as a small state, right? Like what the state does cannot really influence the direction of sea or magnitude of sea level rise over the next decades, right? So we really need to adapt to the changing coastal landscape. But what do we do about those properties that are eventually get flooded? Right? Will the government apply a buyback program or not? But if it's about buyback or compensation, then the government needs to think about, well, how much they should pay for those properties. Of course, there's an issue about moral hazard and others. But I think as we refine the type of study like ours, I think we will be able to come up with some scientifically supported estimates on the extent of property value losses due to sea level rise, and that might be useful for this coastal management. So just to conclude, so this is a joint project with McKenna and others, and it's funded by an NSF funding project about identifying multiple values for beaches and coastlines under sea level rise. So that just acknowledge the funding here. Yeah. Okay, so this is, I think, the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Nori. It made me miss Hawaii with all the pictures that you were showing. Very interesting and informative presentation. Thank you very much. So at this point, we will entertain questions from the audience, both in Zoom and also for those who are joining us on Facebook. Please post your questions on the comment section. Anybody from Zoom who would like to ask the first question? You may unmute and show yourself. Do I see anybody raising? Yes, Randy.
Yes, good morning, Nori. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I learned a lot about doing these estimates. I have a question. Are you estimating only residential property, or I'm sure that in the residential property areas, there are also associated sort of service industries or other types of small enterprises that may be associated also with the sea level rise. Especially, I don't know if, well, I'm not really familiar with Hawaii, but I don't know if there are also tourist areas also besides some of these besides this residential property area. So are the estimates only purely for these residential areas, or are you also looking into these areas of this, services and others? No? Thank you.
Well, Nandi, yeah, thank you very much for a very good question. The study focused on the residential properties. Yeah, that's the limitation so far. And but you are right that along the coastline of Hawaii and other places too, we do see other types of buildings and infrastructure, right? As you mentioned, the commercial and industrial buildings are located in some parts of the coastline. And infrastructure, right? I mentioned flooded roads, right? Those are major concerns too. And another picture that I showed was on Waikiki. It's a major tourist destination with like beaches that attract many visitors. There you will have like lots of like hotels type of properties. So the effects on those non-residential buildings and infrastructure, those are another major concern. So that's something we should be looking at into the future. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. RC?
Thank you, Ma. Very nice presentation, Nori. I was just wondering, Nori, is there already an active insurance market in Hawaii that covers climate change? I was thinking, you mentioned of some insurance earlier, but I failed to link that with the property values that you estimated. Is that something that could influence the outcomes?
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for the question, RC. Right, so what I mentioned is the flood insurance, and that's actually like mandatory for those houses that are located in what's called a flood zone designated by the federal government. So the way it works is that the government decides which areas are prone to flooding, and so any property that is located in within that zone, if you buy a property there, then you need to purchase flood insurance. And but the earlier study that I mentioned looked at well, how this so people need to pay for this flood insurance premium, but it seems that that does not seem to have a statistically significant impact on the property value. In other words, just because you need to pay for flood insurance does not seem to lead to a discount on the property values. And other than that, yeah, I'm not sure if there's any separate insurance for climate change risks, yeah, besides flooding or hurricane.
RC, are you still raising your hand? Is that
No, thank you.
okay. Okay, so we have, may I call on first Florence Galion, then Rex Barrer, and then Bay Aquino Lontok. So Florence, can you also tell us your institutional affiliation? You may unmute and show yourself and ask your question.
I'm Florence Galion from the University of the Philippines, College of Engineering.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, and my question is, how did you determine the exposure of the different properties to sea level rise? And how did you establish those monitoring points? Did you do some leveling or let's say global navigation satellite system monitoring or GPS? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Florence, thanks for the question. Yeah, so the sea level rise risk measurement, let me see. So there are several ways to define that or measure that. The most common way is this what's called passive flooding measure, or it's based on like bathtub modeling. So mainly you look at elevation of each like land grid and decide whether it's inundated or not. with like X feet sea level rise. And so that's almost pretty much it. And so this is the NOAA, National institution of the US, publishes that indicator to it. So it's by 10 meter by 10 meter grid. Yeah, so I think it's based on a GIS data. In addition to that, my colleagues at University of Hawaii at Manoa in coastal geology group, they looked at, I think they had a closer look. I think they're visiting each land area. I think they looked at how the high wave flooding is gonna change due to sea level rise. So this is based on a more detailed modeling in addition to passive flooding. And then you go one step further here with coastal erosion. Here you take into account the fact that the coastal profile of the of itself changes due to sea level rise, and that's gonna cause further erosion. The limitation of this measurement, by the way, coastal erosion, is that this is applicable only to like sandy shorelines, right? Not to like rocky and other types of shores. So because of that, actually the sample size of coastal erosion exposed properties is somewhat more limited than the other measurements. Not sure if I answered your question fully, but that's what I can say about this.
Thank you, Florence. Nori, clarification. So is it a part of your team of the grant that measured this, or you were using their data as an input to your study?
We are using their data. This is really well, coastal geology group work. And one of the advisors in our group is from the coastal geology group. His name is Chip Fletcher. So his group, oh yeah, Fletcher name is right here. So yeah, they lead the study to measure those sea level rise risk exposure.
Okay. Thank you, Florence. Now, may I call on now Rex Barrer? So Rex Barrer, you may please also let us know your institutional affiliation.
Hi, good morning. Rex Barrer with the Department of Economics of the Ateneo de Manila University. Quick question. Thank you very much for the presentation. I do appreciate learning about sea level rise, particularly for property and its impacts. There are other slow onset events as well, and I would like to ask if that would be a likely direction you would take. For example, not necessarily as a consequence of climate change, you might have land subsidence in particular areas, but I'm not sure the extent of that for Hawaii. But would those be other considerations as well? And separately from that, are there actions taken by government, for example, the introduction of easements or no-build zones, particularly for those that will likely have an increasing impact from sea level rise? As we know, the impacts are already increasing. And so the potential, for example, that you're seeing right now will likely increase. And as you also indicated, there are considerations for, say, neighbors' properties being affected. And so that might also affect the property value later on. So that wanted to ask if that is something that you're looking at eventually. Go for.
Thank you very much for the question. So land subsidence due to climate change, I don't think we are capturing that. Even though the sea level rise exposure due to changes in groundwater as opposed to ocean water, I think that is taken into account. And easement and no-build zones, I think they are effective. Plus the seawalls that I mentioned. Right now, private landowners are not allowed to build new seawalls. But historically, despite the regulation, some property owners set up their own seawalls, and there are some lawsuits against those residents. So there will be no more new seawalls. I mean, as long as the law regulation is enforced. But the question is, what should the government do about the existing seawalls, and also those properties that are already there on the coastal front? Will the government wait until they get damaged or inundated, or should the government be more proactive to try to ask them for like setback or a move somewhere else? That's a big policy question. Yeah.
Thank you, Rex and Nori. Bea Aquino Lonto, you may unmute and show yourself. Please also let us know your institutional affiliation. Bea, are you there?
Okay, sorry. I'm Bay. It's not Bea, it's Bay. So
Oh.
I'm from Honolulu, Hawaii. And I'm a property manager, a realtor. And in addition to the question regarding the flood insurance, actually, there's an agency, FEMA, which Nori had mentioned, that kind of oversee the requirement on the insurance. My experience as a property manager, if it's the mortgagee or the bank, if you owe money for the mortgage for the house, that requires the flood insurance. Otherwise, if your property is paid for, they don't really look for it. But as a homeowner, as a protection for yourself, you might as well get it to protect your property. Not only property that are oceanfront or besides the sea that are susceptible to flood. We have also managed a property where they're in the city itself that requires flood insurance. And what I can share with you, flood insurance in Hawaii is very expensive, really expensive. And also, Nori had mentioned, how like the inundation of water to the property will likely affect, or there's like a discounted amount on the property because of that. Well, climate change is inevitable, but what I can tell you right now, I don't see any effect on the property price. The median home prices in Hawaii is now in 1 million. And it's not a mansion or anything, but it's just really expensive. And in addition to that, yeah, the seawall, I know in person, I have a friend who just sold a property that's oceanfront, and there's an existing seawall. So when they sold the property, there was an issue. The seawall broke, and they cannot fix it. The government is not allowing it, but the buyer willingly took the property and paid the property, and they're just gonna take care of it. Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Bea, for misreading your name.
No, it's okay. No problem. Thank you. Okay,
Nori.
aloha. Bye-bye.
Oh no, thank you very much, Bea, for very good observations. Right. I mean, you made a very good point about the mortgage playing a role when it comes to flood insurance. That's something that we haven't looked at yet. Or I don't know to what extent we can look at the actual amount of mortgage for each property transaction. I mean, I thank you for your comments. I mean, that's something we should definitely take a look at. And the effect of sea level rise on properties. So anecdotally, I hear that in some cases, people don't care and go ahead and buy coastal properties with not much discount on one hand. On the other hand, I've heard of some properties that seems to be where the price seems to be trending at a less than average growth. So there may be some effects with some coastal properties. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Bay. There's a question from Facebook. This is from Jason Pagaduan, I think of ADB. Thanks for the insightful presentation. How do you capture cross-sectional dependence in property prices? Also, are the effects of SLR exposure short-lived, or do they persist in the medium run, growth effects?
Okay, good question. About the growth effect, actually, a colleague of mine, Justin Tindo, recently he looked at the coastal properties in the state of New York, and there he looked at the effects of sea level rise exposure on the growth rate of the housing prices, and there he found that yeah, there is a significant effect on the growth rate. But I think both our findings seem to indicate that the discount or premium, they will stay in the long run too, because we are talking about the effect of future sea level rise exposure on the current property prices. And I think there's no strong reason to believe that that's gonna like fluctuate or go away in the short term.
Yeah, the other question of him was, how do you capture cross-sectional dependence in property prices?
Yeah, good question. So the only thing that we applied was to cluster standard errors at the zip code or the neighborhood level. Yeah, to address a cross-sectional dependence in the sense that like your housing property value might be associated with the values of the properties in your neighborhood. Yeah, that's only that's what we did.
Okay. Any other question from Zoom participants? Okay, I have a question, Nori. I don't know, you said that there's a term in your estimating equation where you are trying to make an apple to comparison. I wonder if you have a characteristics where you classify those houses as the second home, as they call it in Hawaii, or something that they rent out. This may be in relation to what base observation that because there's a high turnover rate, so that these characteristics do not really reflect on the property values.
Yeah, very good question, Maha. And yeah, I think Bea mentioned about this too, and that's a good point. I mean, whether it's an owner-occupied property,
Yes.
or more of investment
Yes.
property by, for example, somebody out of state. And there are arguments for both sides, right? I mean, on one hand, out-of-state investors may not care too much about the long-term effects of sea level rise on property values. They might just hold on to the property for only a couple of years and then sell it again. On the other hand, you can also make a counter argument saying that those investors, they are like savvy, right? They are more experienced in the real estate market, so they might care more about those coastal risk factors. So it's kind of hard to say. I try to address that, but what I remember is that either there are some missing data on this variable, like whether it's owner or occupied or an investment or not, or the share of either owner occupied or investor owned was like kind of skewed, so that it was hard for us to incorporate that in the regression model. But yeah, that is a good point. Yeah, maybe I should try to look at that again. Thanks.
Okay. Do we have any more question? One last question from Zoom participants. Okay, it's also already past 11, so I think that is all the time that we have for the seminar this morning. At this point, I'd like to invite everyone to turn on their camera for our photo session with the speaker. So please, let's turn on our camera. But before, so while you're fixing your hair, let me invite you to our seminar next week. So our speaker is Professor Dean Yang from University of Michigan. This time it's going to be at 9 o'clock because of the time difference. So it's relatively early. And again, I'd like to invite you to visit our website for the materials that if you're interested with the materials for all the seminar.